Hello. So in this episode of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about the rebuttal. So the rebuttal is a particular genre of writing. It's a particular approach. It is a type of counter-argument that essentially focuses on showing the other side why their position is wrong. Now, this can be quite tricky, so that's something you want to be aware of. There are different approaches to the rebuttal, and there are different things that you want to be thinking about when you're composing a rebuttal. So a rebuttal is a subsection of the Toulmin argument. So you can see my video on the Toulmin argument, and you should be seeing a link for that on your screen. But the rebuttal can also stand on its own as its own particular document. The key component of a rebuttal is going to be to respond to another text, whether that's an article, whether that's a book, whether that's a tweet, as we see very often nowadays in politics, whether that's a speech, whatever it is. And the idea essentially behind a rebuttal is to make the argument that the initial source is in some way wrong, either in whole or in part, and that your position is actually the correct one. These are maybe the two key goals of the rebuttal. So, again, you can disagree with the whole thing. This person is entirely wrong. Nothing that they have said is correct in any sense. Or you can disagree in part. And this actually gives you a lot more leverage in terms of making connections and trying to find common ground, which is something we're going to talk more about later in this video. So if there are things that a person has argued that you think are right, but there are other things you think are wrong, that's one approach to rebuttal. That's the other approach to rebuttal. So entirely wrong, partially right. The other thing that you want to do in a good rebuttal is to provide evidence and reasoning for why your position is correct. So it's not enough to simply attack the other side. You have to provide your own counter-argument. You have to provide your own argument for why your position is the proper one. So I'm not going to talk too much about those because I've done other videos that'll help you with sort of general constructions of rhetoric. But what I do want to talk about in terms of the rebuttal is tone and style, because these are really significant when we're constructing effective rebuttals. And one of the things that we need to be most conscious of when we're writing rebuttals is who we're writing for. And the way that I see it, there are two broad categories that we might write for in a rebuttal. One is to try and persuade the other side, to try and persuade the person or people who disagree with us. The other is simply to reinforce what people on our side already think, what we might call preaching to the choir. And these are each going to require different degrees of finesse, different degrees of subtlety, and different tone and stylistic choices. So, if you're writing to persuade people on the other side, you're going to run into a big problem. And that problem is confirmation bias. And I've done a video on confirmation bias before, which you should be seeing a link for right now. Confirmation bias essentially means that we as human beings are psychologically wired to believe even questionable evidence that supports what we already think, and to reject even well-supported arguments that disagree with what we already think. This is part of the reason it's so difficult to convince people, especially on big issues. So, when you're writing for people who disagree with you, when you're writing for the other side, one of the things that you want to be thinking about is their values. So what is it that they believe is important? What is it that they are concerned with? What is it that they would be persuaded by. So is this audience going to be persuaded by appeals to patriotism? Are they going to be persuaded by statistics? Are they going to be persuaded by stories or anecdotes? Are they going to be persuaded by empathy? Are they going to be persuaded by images? What kinds of tools and techniques and strategies are going to get to this audience? And different audiences have different values, different concerns, and different things that are going to be rhetorically effective for them. So, again, I talked about this in the confirmation bias video. If you're a conservative and you believe that, for instance, tradition is really important, which is a value conservatives tend to hold, much more so than liberals, if you make your argument based on the importance of tradition, you're unlikely to persuade your liberal audience. Whereas, if you can make your argument based on the value of, say, empathy or encounters with the new, those are values that liberals tend to hold in much higher regard than conservatives. So you're more likely to persuade the other side. So that's one thing to think about with a rebuttal. If you're writing to people who disagree with you, try and write from their perspective. Try and write the way that they would write if they were making your argument. So that's going to be much more effective. Now, on the other hand, if you're writing just to reinforce the position of people who already think what you think, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, preaching to the choir is a fine form of preaching. If that's your goal, if you're just writing basically to sort of repeat what your readers or listeners or viewers already believe, you have much lower constraints in terms of being rhetorically successful. Like, you can build arguments the way that it makes sense to you to build those arguments, and you can take the gloves off to a certain extent. I mean, if you're trying to persuade people on the other side, you don't really want to be using language that attacks this author or video maker or whatever, or tweeter or whatever it is. You don't necessarily want to say, this person is so dumb, their position is evil, they're un-American, or whatever it is, because that's not going to convince people on the other side. They're going to say, oh, I think that, and I'm not stupid or evil or unpatriotic or whatever it is. So you're not going to make that connection. Whereas when you're writing for people who agree with you, you can go for it. It's not necessarily a good idea to sort of go for it and say, these, whatever these are on the other side, whoever it is that I'm disagreeing with, they're so terrible, I'm going to insult them and tear them down and not even worry about being tactful. You can do that. Again, it's not necessarily a great plan to do it, it's not necessarily an ethical approach to writing, but in terms of achieving your goal of reinforcing what your side already believes, it is a legitimate approach to the rebuttal. So again, that's the thing that you want to be thinking about is, I'm disagreeing with this argument fundamentally, whether, again, that's in whole or in part, whether I'm disagreeing with the entirety of the argument or just a specific point that's been made. And you want to think about how you persuade your intended audience. What style, what tone, what types of arguments do you present to show your readers why your perspective is right?